She slapped the cuffs on him, convinced no one would question her word. But when he walked into that courtroom, she realized she had made the biggest mistake of her career. Damon Fletcher had always been a man who preferred staying out of trouble. His life was structured, deliberate. He wasn't the type to take risks. But none of that mattered when Officer Erica Manning stepped into that convenience store on a quiet afternoon in Fort Worth, Texas. The store was mostly empty. Damon had come in for something simple, coffee and a snack before heading home. He had just left the self-checkout when he felt it, that sharp, unsettling sense that someone was watching him. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." The voice was sharp, authoritative. Damon turned, confused, and found himself staring at a uniformed officer with a hand resting casually on her holstered weapon. "Officer Manning." He glanced around, certain there must be some misunderstanding. "Is there a problem?" Her expression was unreadable. But her stance told him she had already made up her mind. "I just saw you put something in your pocket after scanning a few items. Mind showing me your receipt?" Damon furrowed his brow, shifting his bag to his other hand. "I just paid. You can check the register." Manning's lips pressed into a thin line. "I said, show me your receipt." Damon took a slow breath and reached into the plastic bag. Retrieving the small slip of paper, he extended it toward her. Keeping his movements deliberate, Manning snatched it and barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "Nice try. Empty your pockets." A few people had turned to watch, their gazes bouncing between the two, like spectators at a match. They watched. Damon kept his voice calm. "I don't have anything in my pockets." Manning's patience snapped in an instant. Hands against the counter. Damon's jaw clenched. This wasn't about a missing item. She wasn't checking a receipt. He had seen this play out too many times. In too many places, with too many people who looked like him. "I told you. I didn't take anything," he said, keeping his voice level. Manning's hand dropped to her radio dispatch. "I've got a possible shoplifting suspect. Resisting compliance." Resisting compliance. Damon exhaled slowly. He was standing still, hands visible, voice calm, but none of that mattered. A store clerk, a young man in a company vest, hesitated before stepping forward. I actually saw him pay for everything." Manning didn't even turn her head. "Stay out of this." Damon's heart pounded. He could already see where this was going. "Look, you're making a mistake," he said, his voice steady. "I have a law degree. I know my rights." Manning let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, you can explain your rights downtown." Before Damon could respond, she reached for his wrist the moment her fingers tightened. A choice flickered in his mind. He could pull away, demand to speak to a supervisor, fight, but none of that would end well, so he let her. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped against his skin, sending a ripple of tension through the small store. Manning's grip was firm as she guided him toward the exit. Where her squad car waited, Damon caught sight of his reflection in the store's glass door as they stepped outside. He had seen plenty of people in his position before. Now, for the first time, he was one of them, but he knew something Erica Manning didn't. This wasn't going to end the way she thought. The ride to the station was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the radio. Damon sat in the back, hands cuffed, staring out at the city as it passed by in a blur. He knew better than to speak. Anything he said would be twisted, misinterpreted, used against him. Manning, on the other hand, seemed at ease, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near her radio. She had done this before, probably too many times to count. When they pulled up to the station, she parked with an air of finality and stepped out, opening the back door like she had just reeled in her latest catch. "Let's go." Damon didn't resist. He stepped out, head high, jaw set. Inside, officers barely spared him a glance as Manning led him past the front desk. "Shoplifting," she said, casually handing over his wallet and personal belongings to the officer on duty. The officer behind the desk, a tired-looking man with graying hair, gave Manning a sideways glance. "Serious?" Manning shrugged. "Had to detain him. Guy was getting hostile." Damon clenched his fists. Hostile. He had barely raised his voice, but that word, hostile, meant something different when it was attached to a man like him, a younger officer. Maybe in his early 30s. Flipped through Damon's wallet and pulled out a bar association card. His eyes flicked up. "You're a lawyer?" Damon exhaled through his nose. "Yes." Manning snorted. "Sure he is." The young officer turned the card over, his eyes narrowing. "He's telling the truth." He looked at Manning. "You sure about this charge?" Manning's face tightened. He had stolen from the store. The young officer hesitated, then looked at Damon. "Sir, do you have a lawyer?" Damon met his gaze. "I don't need one." A slow, almost amused smirk crossed the officer's face. He glanced at Manning before handing Damon's wallet back. "You're going to represent yourself?" Damon nodded. "Absolutely." Manning let out a short, irritated breath and turned on her heel. "Fine, get him processed." Damon was led down a hallway, past a row of holding cells. He had seen places like this before. From the other side now he was here. Waiting, just like the men he had once fought to defend. He sat on the bench, watching the minutes crawl by. He knew how this worked. They'd hold him for as long as they legally could. Try to pressure him into a plea deal, or worse, let him sit in jail over the weekend to make him learn his lesson. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. The door creaked open, and a guard stepped in. "You're being arraigned in the morning." Damon nodded, his mind already working through the strategy. He wouldn't just prove his innocence. He was going to make sure this never happened to another man like him again. Manning. Though, she still thought she had already won, but she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The courtroom was colder than Damon expected. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the polished wood of the judge's bench. He sat at the defense table, hands folded neatly in front of him, the weight of the cuffs from the night before still fresh on his wrists. Across the room, Officer Erica Manning stood confidently, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable to her. This was routine, a simple case of a shoplifter who got caught and would now be processed like so many others before him. She hadn't even bothered to check the name on the docket. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted her glasses and glanced at the prosecution. "Let's move this along. What are the charges?" The prosecutor, a young man with an overconfident smirk, stood up. "Your Honor, the defendant, Damon Fletcher, was caught stealing from a local convenience store. Officer Manning witnessed the crime firsthand and detained him after he refused to comply." Damon let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly. The lies had started early. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Fletcher, do you have legal representation?" Damon stood, buttoning his suit jacket with steady hands. "I do, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself." A murmur rippled through the small audience in the back. Even the prosecutor's smug expression faltered slightly. Manning, however, barely reacted. The judge nodded. "Very well, Mr. Fletcher. How do you plead?" "Not guilty." His voice was firm, unwavering. The judge looked toward the prosecution. "Let's hear the officer's testimony." Manning stepped forward, a picture of confidence. "Your Honor, I was on patrol when I entered the convenience store and saw the defendant pocket an item without paying. I approached him and asked to see his receipt, which he failed to produce. He then became argumentative and refused to comply with my instructions." Damon tilted his head slightly. He had heard bad testimonies before, but this was particularly sloppy. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Fletcher, you may cross-examine." Damon stood, adjusting his tie. He took a step forward, hands resting lightly on the defense table. "Courtroom tension." "Officer Manning, you said you saw me take an item and put it in my pocket?" "Yes." "And you claim I didn't produce a receipt?" "That's correct." Manning confirmed. Damon nodded, pacing slowly. "Were there security cameras in the store?" Manning hesitated for just a second, but Damon caught it. "Yes. But that footage hasn't been reviewed yet." Manning admitted. Damon turned to the prosecutor. "Did your office request the footage?" The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't deemed necessary at the time." Damon let that sit for a moment before continuing. "Officer Manning, you also stated that I refused to comply. In what way?" Manning straightened. You became aggressive, refused to empty your pockets when asked, and resisted when I attempted to detain you. Damon pressed his lips together and nodded. Interesting. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit A into evidence, my purchase receipt, which was in my possession at the time of arrest. He walked over to the bailiff. Handing over the neatly folded slip of paper, the judge examined it, her brows lifting slightly. This receipt shows that Mr. Fletcher did, in fact, pay for all of his items, she said, glancing over her glasses at Manning. Officer, did you examine this at the time of the arrest? Manning's posture stiffened. I must have overlooked it. Damon turned back to him. You must have overlooked it. His voice was even, but the pressure in the room had shifted. Manning's jaw clenched. Damon let the silence stretch just long enough. Officer, do you have any body cam footage of the arrest? Manning hesitated again. My body cam was malfunctioning. The judge's eyes narrowed. You didn't mention that in your report. Damon folded his arms. So, no body cam footage, no security footage reviewed, and a receipt proving my innocence that was ignored. The tension in the room was palpable. He let out a low chuckle. Tell me, Officer Manning, were you absolutely sure I stole something? Or did you just decide I looked like someone who would? A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Manning's face flushed, her hands balling into fists at her sides. But this was just the beginning. The real unraveling was about to start. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Manning stood rigid, her face unreadable, but Damon could see the tension in her jaw, the slight shift of her weight from one foot to the other. She had expected a quick, uncontested case, a rubber stamp conviction. But now, the floor was crumbling beneath her. Damon kept his voice calm, controlled. Officer Manning, let's go back to your report. You stated that I was hostile and resisted compliance. Manning lifted her chin slightly. That's correct. He nodded. Could you describe exactly what I did that was hostile? She hesitated. Just for a second, but the delay was enough. You refused to empty your pockets. You raised your voice. Damon tilted his head. I see. So, raising my voice after being falsely accused is considered hostility? Manning didn't answer. Damon turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit B, video testimony from a store employee who witnessed the entire encounter. The prosecutor shot up from his seat. Objection. This witness wasn't disclosed prior to trial. The judge waved a dismissive hand. Overruled. Let's hear it. The bailiff pressed play on a screen at the front of the courtroom. The grainy footage showed a young store clerk sitting at a desk, eyes shifting nervously as he spoke. I saw everything. The man, Damon Fletcher, he paid for his stuff at self-checkout. Then the officer walked in. Damon watched as Officer Manning looked at him for a second, then went straight toward him. She never even checked the security footage. She just assumed. A hush fell over the courtroom. Damon studied Manning's face. She was stiff, her hands clasped behind her back. But her eyes flickered. Just for a second. Damon turned to her. Officer Manning, did you bother asking the store clerk what he saw before making the arrest? Manning's jaw clenched. Or did you decide the moment you saw me that I was guilty? A vein in Manning's temple twitched. That's not what happened. Damon nodded slowly. Okay then, let's break it down. No security footage reviewed, no body cam footage, no witness statements, just your word against mine. Except now, he pulled out a slip of paper. I have a receipt. A witness. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to request a review of Officer Manning's past arrest reports. The prosecutor's chair scraped against the floor. Objection. That's irrelevant to this case. Damon smiled. I think it's extremely relevant. If Officer Manning has a pattern of wrongful arrests, it speaks directly to the credibility of her testimony today. The judge studied him for a moment, then nodded. Request granted. The prosecutor slumped slightly in his chair. Damon folded his hands on the table. Officer Manning, do you have a history of wrongful arrests? Her face paled. No. Damon gave a slow nod. Interesting. He turned toward the bailiff, who was already pulling up files on a screen. Because public records show you've had 3 complaints of racial profiling in the last 2 years alone. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Manning's fingers twitched at her sides. Damon turned back to her. His voice steady. Officer, how many of those cases involved black men? The silence stretched. Manning finally spoke. Her voice tight. That has nothing to do with this case. Damon raised an eyebrow. Doesn't it? She shifted slightly, glancing toward the prosecutor, but he was already rubbing his temple, clearly regretting ever taking this case to trial. Damon let the weight of the moment sink in before speaking again. Your Honor. At this point, it's clear that I was not only falsely arrested, but that Officer Manning acted with bias and negligence. I move to have this case dismissed immediately. The judge didn't hesitate. Motion granted. Case dismissed. Damon exhaled. He had won, but he wasn't finished yet, because some victories were bigger than just one case. And Officer Manning was about to learn that firsthand. The gavel struck once. Firm and final. Manning barely moved. She stood frozen, shoulders squared. But Damon could see the shift, the realization creeping in. She had come into this courtroom expecting another easy conviction, another name in a system that rarely questioned her word. But now, her name was the one under scrutiny. Damon adjusted his suit jacket. His movements measured, deliberate. He wasn't the kind of man to gloat. But he also wasn't the kind to let things slide. As he gathered his things, the judge's voice cut through the silence. Before we conclude, Officer Manning. I need to address something. Manning snapped her attention. Yes, Your Honor. The judge removed her glasses, studying the officer with a gaze that had weighed the fate of many before her. The court doesn't take allegations of misconduct lightly. And Mr. Fletcher's case has raised serious concerns. As of now, I am formally recommending an internal investigation into your actions, both in this case and in your previous complaints. Manning's face drained of color. Your Honor. That's unnecessary, she said quickly. The judge held up a hand. That's not for you to decide. She turned to the bailiff. Make sure the appropriate parties receive my recommendation. Damon watched Manning swallow hard, her fingers tightening into fists at her sides. He stepped forward, keeping his voice level. Officer Manning, you were so sure of my guilt that you didn't bother to check the facts. You let your bias dictate your decision. You saw me and made up your mind before I even opened my mouth. She said nothing. Damon continued, his voice calm but firm. I could have lost my job over this. My reputation, my freedom, but I fought back because I could. Because I had the knowledge and the means. He let that sink in. But what about the people who don't? Manning's lips parted slightly as if she wanted to respond. But no words came out. Damon shook his head. You've arrested how many people who looked like me? How many of them didn't have the resources to fight back? The question hung in the air. Heavy and damning, the courtroom doors swung open, and a man in a dark suit strode in, a police department official. He exchanged a quiet word with the bailiff before approaching the judge's bench. The judge nodded, then turned back to Manning. Officer Manning, you are hereby placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending an investigation. Manning's face twisted in shock. This isn't fair. Damon let out a quiet breath. Neither was my arrest. The silence in the room was deafening. Manning was escorted out, her steps heavy, her face pale, the weight of consequences finally settling on her shoulders. Damon picked up his briefcase, running a hand over the smooth leather. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was something bigger, because today, a system that rarely held people like Officer Manning accountable had finally taken notice. Damon stepped out of the courthouse into the midday sun. Inhaling deeply, the air felt different, lighter, clearer, though he knew it wasn't. The world hadn't changed in the last few hours. But maybe, just maybe, one person had been forced to see it differently. He walked down the steps slowly, his mind still processing everything that had happened, the false accusation, the courtroom battle, Manning's downfall. It was a small victory. But victories like these mattered. A voice cut through his thoughts. Mr. Fletcher. Damon turned to see the young officer from the precinct jogging toward him, The same one who had hesitated when Manning handed over his wallet. The one who had seen the truth before anyone else had wanted to acknowledge it. The officer stopped a few feet away. Catching his breath, I just wanted to say, what you did in there, that was something. Damon raised an eyebrow. The officer scratched the back of his neck. I mean, I see cases like this all the time. People arrested over nothing, stuck in the system because they can't fight back. It happens more than it should. He exhaled. But I've never seen someone turn it around like that. Not in court. Damon studied him for a moment. You ever speak up when you see it happening? The officer's jaw tightened slightly. It's not that easy. Damon nodded, watching him squirm. Neither was proving my innocence. The officer's shoulders sagged a little. He knew Damon was right. Damon glanced back at the courthouse doors. It starts with one person saying something, doing something, not just looking the other way. The way the officer shifted on his feet, yeah. He looked down, then back up. Look, the officer said, his voice quieter now. Manning's not the only one like that on the force. But not all of us are like her. Damon gave him a long look before finally responding. Then prove it. The officer nodded once, then turned and walked away. Disappearing into the sea of people moving through the city streets. Damon stood there for a moment, letting it all sink in. He had won his case. But the battle was bigger than just him. There were too many people who wouldn't get their day in court. Too many who didn't have the knowledge, the resources, or even the chance to fight back. And that was what needed to change. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen for a moment before dialing a number. A woman's voice answered on the other end. Damon, everything okay? He smiled slightly. Yeah, Mom, everything's okay. She exhaled, relief thick in her voice. Good, I've been praying all morning. Damon leaned against the railing, his eyes scanning the streets below. I think I know what I want to do next. A pause. Oh? He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I want to start something. Maybe a legal defense fund. Something for people who don't have the means to fight back. His mother's voice softened. That's a big undertaking, baby. He smiled. Yeah. But I think it's the right thing to do. She was quiet for a moment before she finally said, I think you're right. Damon slipped his phone back into his pocket. He had walked into that courtroom as a defendant. He walked out as something else. Something more, because today wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about making sure the next person falsely accused didn't have to do it alone, and that was a fight worth taking on.